An innocent man is sentenced to death for a murder he didn't commit, but just days before his execution, his teenage daughter uncovers a secret that could shake the justice system to its core. What she does next, no one saw coming. The rain fell hard that night in Elm Ridge, a small, tucked-away town in Missouri where nothing big ever happened, until everything changed. Streetlights flickered as the police cruisers rolled silently up Sycamore Lane. The blue and red lights painted shadows across the white picket fences, startling the neighbors from their peaceful sleep. Inside the modest one-story home at the end of the cul-de-sac, Judson Wesley was rinsing dishes after dinner. His 17-year-old daughter, Cavery, sat at the kitchen table finishing homework, her headphones in, the faint buzz of music shielding her from the world. She didn't hear the knock at first. But Judson did. It was firm. Purposeful. He dried his hands on a dish towel and walked to the door. The second knock came harder, louder. When he opened it, 3 officers stood there. One had his hand on his holster. Another held a warrant. The third just stared. "Judson Wesley," the first officer asked. "Yes. Can I help?" "You're under arrest for the murder of Milton Crane." Judson blinked. "What?" Before he could fully process the words, they were already turning him around, snapping cold metal around his wrists. Cavery ripped off her headphones just in time to hear her father yell out, confused and protesting, as the officers pushed him through the door and into the rain. She rushed after them, barefoot and frantic. "Dad? Dad, what's happening?" Judson tried to turn back, tried to speak, but the officers shoved him into the back of the cruiser. "I didn't do this. Cavery, listen to me, baby. I didn't do it. Find the truth. Don't let them." The door slammed shut, cutting off his voice. Cavery stood frozen in the driveway, soaked to the bone, shaking as the cruiser pulled away into the storm. All around her, porch lights turned on. Curious faces peeked through curtains. Whispers echoed from every direction. Her father was no killer. He was the man who cried when her mother died. The man who stayed up at night fixing her bike. The man who worked 2 jobs to make sure she never went without. And now they were calling him a murderer. She didn't know how. She didn't know why. But in that moment, as the thunder rolled across the sky and her world fell apart, one thing settled deep into her chest like fire. She would not rest until she found out who really did it. 6 days. That's how long the trial lasted. 6 days to decide the fate of a man who had never so much as gotten a parking ticket. The courtroom was small, hot, and crowded. Reporters lined the back, notebooks in hand. Locals packed the benches, some out of morbid curiosity, others hoping to catch a glimpse of what real tragedy looked like. The air buzzed with whispers and judgment. Cavery sat alone in the front row, her fists clenched in her lap. Her eyes never left her father. Judson looked tired, hollowed out. His eyes were rimmed red, not from guilt, but from sleepless nights and disbelief. He wore the same dark suit he had worn to her mother's funeral. The tie was slightly crooked, just like back then. The prosecutor, Eldrick Hayworth, was sharp and theatrical. Every word he spoke was laced with venom masked as conviction. He painted Judson as a jealous, bitter neighbor, someone who resented Milton Crane's success, his power, his influence. Hayworth spun a story of rage and revenge, a narrative built on shaky evidence and a single damning detail, a kitchen knife found in a nearby dumpster, bearing both the victim's blood and Judson's DNA on the handle. There was one eyewitness, Irvin Bell, a man who lived 2 houses down. He claimed he saw Judson leave Crane's home the night of the murder, though he couldn't recall the exact time. He had no timestamp, no photo, just his word. But to the jury, it was enough. Judson's court-appointed attorney, Malcolm Triggs, barely put up a fight. He was disorganized, tired, and overwhelmed. He didn't challenge Irvin's inconsistencies, didn't question why there were no fingerprints on the blade, didn't demand the surveillance footage from the convenience store down the street. He simply repeated, "My client maintains his innocence," and left it at that. Cavery's nails dug into her palms so hard they nearly drew blood. She wanted to scream, to stand up and shout that this wasn't justice, it was slaughter. On the 6th day, the jury returned after just 3 hours. Guilty. The word echoed like a shot in the silent room. Cavery gasped, covering her mouth. Judson closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, as if his soul had just been drained from his body. The judge, a gray-haired woman named Lynette Coulson, barely blinked. Her voice was cold as steel. "Judson Wesley, for the crime of first-degree murder, you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection." The room didn't gasp. It didn't wail. It just accepted. Like it was already a foregone conclusion. Like the town had been waiting for someone to blame. Cavery collapsed forward, sobbing into her hands, unable to breathe. The guards escorted Judson out in silence. As he passed by her, he paused for the briefest second, looked at her through tear-stung eyes, and whispered, "Don't let them win." Then he was gone. And Cavery, heartbroken and helpless, sat among strangers who watched her pain with apathy, already moving on to the next tragedy. 3 days after the sentencing, Cavery sat alone in her darkened bedroom, staring at the ceiling with eyes that hadn't closed in 72 hours. Outside, the world carried on, cars drove past, dogs barked, birds sang, but inside, time had collapsed. Nothing felt real. Not the creak of the floorboards. Not the numb ache in her chest. Not even the fact that her father, the only family she had left, was going to die. People she had grown up with, neighbors, teachers, former friends, avoided her now. The stares at the grocery store, the awkward silences in the school hallways, the way even teachers hesitated before speaking her name. In their eyes, she was the daughter of a killer. The shame by association had swallowed her whole. But Cavery wasn't interested in their judgment anymore. Grief had cracked something inside her, something quiet and fierce. She couldn't sit in silence while the man who tucked her in every night for 17 years waited to die for a crime he didn't commit. That thought alone woke her up like a slap. She walked into the hallway and stood in front of her father's study, which hadn't been touched since his arrest. The room still smelled faintly of his cologne, cedar and something crisp, like pine. She opened his desk drawers one by one, searching, pulling out legal pads, old bills, sticky notes. In one of the bottom drawers, she found a small metal lockbox. It held every letter her father had ever written to her mother during her hospital stays. Words of love. Of fear. Of hope. And in the back, folded neatly, was a newspaper clipping, Crane appointed to Ethics Oversight Committee. Dated just a week before the murder. That didn't feel random. That night, Cavery visited her father in prison. Redstone Hills Correctional Facility loomed like a mountain of steel and grief. She passed through metal detectors, empty hallways, buzzing gates. When she finally sat across from her father, separated by thick plexiglass, she could barely hold it together. He looked older. His eyes were tired, but there was something unbroken in them. He picked up the receiver with shaking hands. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly. "You should be living your life." "I can't," Cavery replied, tears threatening. "Not while you're sitting in here for something you didn't do." Judson tried to smile, but it faltered. "I don't want you to waste your youth chasing ghosts." She leaned in closer to the glass. "Then give me a reason not to. Did you kill him?" "No," his voice didn't shake. "Not then. Not ever." That was enough. That was all she needed. "Then I'm going to prove it." Judson went quiet. The tension between them hung heavy. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if praying. Then he opened them again and whispered, if you go down this road, Cavery, you'll lose people. Friends. Safety. Maybe even your future. Are you sure? She nodded without hesitation. You're my future. He swallowed hard. Start with Hayworth, he said. I saw something in his eyes during the trial, like he wanted this more than he should have. Cavery memorized that name. Eldrick Hayworth. The prosecutor who had torn her father apart with no remorse. Something about him hadn't sat right even then, but now, it felt like a trailhead. That night, back in her room, Cavery took out a notebook and wrote 3 words on the first page. Find the truth. She dropped out of high school the next morning. She didn't tell anyone. Just packed her backpack, withdrew her name quietly, and started taking online courses in criminal law, investigative journalism, and digital forensics. She worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner to pay for tuition and books. Customers barely noticed her, which suited her just fine. She listened more than she spoke. Observed more than she acted. Months passed. Seasons changed. But Cavery's resolve only grew sharper. She followed every thread she could find, every case Hayworth had prosecuted, every complaint filed against him, every person who'd crossed paths with him and come out burned. And slowly, very slowly, something began to surface. Cracks in the story. Gaps in the timeline. And a chilling possibility that maybe, just maybe, Milton Crane hadn't been killed by a man in a rage. Maybe he had been silenced. And the wrong man had been made to take the fall. It was in the middle of a quiet, gray afternoon when Cavery found it, the first real crack in the wall of lies. She was sitting at a booth in the back of the diner where she worked, her shift just ended. The scent of burnt coffee and fried grease clung to her clothes, but her focus was locked on her laptop, headphones in, as she scrolled through hours of trial transcripts and police reports she'd painstakingly requested through public records. The surveillance footage, or rather, the absence of it, had been gnawing at her for weeks. According to the official timeline, Milton Crane was killed sometime between 9:40 and 10:15 p.m. The convenience store across from Crane's house had cameras that pointed directly at his front yard. That footage, logically, should have shown someone entering or exiting the property. But it wasn't submitted as evidence in court. Instead, the prosecution claimed that the cameras had been malfunctioning that night. That explanation never sat right with Cavery. So she began digging into the company that installed the cameras, Arrowhawk Security Systems. After days of cold emails and fake identities, she managed to get in contact with a former technician named Tobin Hartwell. He was in his early 40s, lived 3 towns over, and had left the company just weeks after the trial. His record wasn't exactly clean, he'd done time for petty theft and fraud. But he agreed to meet her at a gas station just off Highway 17. He looked at her warily, arms crossed as he leaned against his beat-up truck. "You're that Wesley girl," he said, more like a statement than a question. "Yeah," she replied. "I just want to know what happened with those cameras." Tobin scratched the back of his neck. "Look, I don't want trouble. I got kids now. A job. A girlfriend who actually trusts me. I don't need the past messing that up." Cavery pulled out a flash drive and held it up. "I'm not here to get you in trouble. I just want to know the truth. I already know the footage never made it into evidence. I just need to know why." He looked at her, eyes narrowing, as if weighing 1,000 invisible risks. Then, after a long silence, he exhaled. "I was paid off to disable the system that night. Got an envelope of cash, $2,000, maybe more. No return address. Just a burner phone and a note, disable camera 3 and 4, on Sycamore Lane. Between 9 and 10 p.m. No questions." "Who paid you?" Cavery asked. Tobin hesitated. "I didn't know at the time. But a few days later, I recognize the guy from a press conference on TV. Same voice. Same watch. Same smug face. Who? He looked her straight in the eye. Eldrick Hayworth. The name hit her like a punch to the chest. You're sure, she whispered. Positive. Man's got a voice like a preacher and eyes like a rattlesnake. Cavery's mind raced. This was more than coincidence. This was tampering with evidence. It was deliberate. Calculated. And it meant that Hayworth didn't just prosecute the case, he might have orchestrated it. Before leaving, Tobin handed her a USB. That's the backup footage. I made a copy before I wiped the servers. Thought maybe someday, I'd need to cover my own ass. Guess that day's today. Back at home, Cavery plugged the drive into her laptop. Her hands trembled as she opened the files. The footage wasn't perfect, grainy, timestamp flickering, but at 9:53 p.m., a tall man in a long coat and gloves exited Crane's front door. He paused, glanced up the street, and walked calmly to a black sedan parked out of frame. Cavery froze the frame. Zoomed in. It wasn't her father. He was taller. Leaner. Moved differently. And on his left wrist, just visible under his coat sleeve, was a silver-faced watch with a black leather band, the exact kind Hayworth had been wearing during the trial. It wasn't proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. But it was a thread, thicker, stronger, and more dangerous than anything she'd found so far. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The man who sentenced her father to die may have been the one who actually committed the crime. And now, Cavery knew one thing for certain. If Hayworth found out she had this footage, she wouldn't be the only one in danger. But it didn't matter. The noose around the truth was starting to loosen. And she was just getting started. Cavery knew she couldn't do this alone anymore. The footage was too important, and too dangerous, to keep tucked away on a single USB drive in her bedroom drawer. If Hayworth had silenced one man, there was no telling what he'd do to keep his secrets buried. She needed protection. She needed legitimacy. She needed people who knew how to take down giants. That's when she found Innocence Alliance, a non-profit legal group known for overturning wrongful convictions. It took weeks of emails, voicemails, and begging, but finally, someone answered, Martin Ames, a former defense attorney who'd spent his life fighting corruption in the justice system. He'd been semi-retired, teaching ethics law at a community college, but her story stirred something in him. They met in a tiny office above a bookstore in downtown St. Louis. He was in his 60s, white-haired but razor-sharp, dressed in a worn blazer and carrying a yellow legal pad covered in meticulous notes. With him was his young assistant, Laken Rowe, a 25-year-old law student with combat boots, a silver nose ring, and a photographic memory. Cavery sat across from them and told everything: her father's arrest, the rushed trial, the missing footage, the conversation with Tobin Hartwell, and the video that showed a man who looked far too much like Eldrick Hayworth walking out of Milton Crane's house the night of the murder. Martin listened without interrupting. He didn't blink once. When she finished, he leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "If what you're saying is true, your father didn't just get framed, he got buried alive." Laken added, "And if Hayworth's behind this, you're stepping into a minefield. That man has political ambitions. He's protected. He plays dirty." Cavery nodded. "I know. But I don't care. I need to clear my father's name." Martin smiled, slow and sad. "Then let's go to war." The next few weeks were a blur of investigation. Martin filed motions to reopen Judson's case. Laken started combing through all of Hayworth's past convictions. They found patterns, dozens of convictions where evidence had mysteriously vanished, where witnesses had been intimidated, where public defenders had been outmaneuvered with impossible speed. It was a web of rushed justice that all led back to one man. Meanwhile, Cavery dug deeper into Milton Crane himself. She learned that, just a week before his death, Crane had written a private complaint to the State Bar Association accusing Hayworth of funneling county funds into a shell corporation for personal gain. The document had never been filed, but a digital copy still existed on Crane's old work laptop, which had somehow never been entered into police evidence. The laptop was found in an evidence locker labeled miscellaneous, covered in dust, untouched since the day of the murder. When Lakin cracked the drive, the last draft of the complaint was still there, along with a voice memo, Crane's voice, shaky but clear. "If this reaches the wrong hands, I may not make it to the hearing. But I won't be silent. I know what Eldrick's done. And if something happens to me, start by looking at the money." It was damning. It was motive. It was everything the original trial should have considered. Martin and his team compiled a fresh case file, the hidden footage, Crane's draft complaint, the voice memo, Tobin Hartwell's sworn affidavit. But time was against them. The date of Judson's execution was now only 31 days away. Still, Martin believed they had enough for an emergency petition to the state Supreme Court. It would be risky. If denied, the execution would proceed without delay. But Cavery didn't hesitate. "File it," she said. "I don't care what it takes." Late one night, after another long meeting at the office, Martin placed a hand on Cavery's shoulder. "You know," he said gently, "most people your age are worried about college applications. Dating. Graduation." She looked at him, her eyes tired but burning. "Most people don't have to save their father's life." Martin nodded. "You're not most people." Outside the office, the wind howled through the alley. Inside, for the first time in weeks, Cavery felt the faintest spark of hope. The truth was finally taking shape. Now they just had to make the world believe it. The petition was filed. Martin worked through the night drafting the language with precision, building it brick by brick from the evidence they'd unearthed, the suppressed video footage, the technical affidavit, the unsubmitted laptop files, the damning voice memo. The motion was urgent, bold, and carried the weight of a dying man's last hope. It was sent to the state Supreme Court under emergency review. All they could do now was wait. But Cavery didn't wait well. She couldn't sleep. Couldn't sit still. The thought of her father waking up every morning in a concrete box, counting the days to his death, made her skin crawl. She needed more. Something undeniable. Something that wouldn't just stall the execution, but blow the entire case wide open. She turned back to the paper trail. Hidden inside Crane's financials, through the complaint he never filed, were names of dummy corporations, shell companies registered to empty office spaces across Missouri. And one of them, Blackwood Civic Holdings, had a shared address with a campaign office once used by Eldrick Hayworth during his brief run for district judge years ago. Coincidence? She didn't think so. Using a throwaway laptop and an encrypted connection, Cavery began tracking the registration documents of Blackwood Civic Holdings. The listed agent was a man named Nico Delank, a fake name, according to every background check she could find. No driver's license. No utility bills. No record of existence. But the digital signature on the registration document? It belonged to Letty Van Rose, Hayworth's former legal aide. Cavery took this to Lakin, who cross-referenced Letty's employment history. She'd left Hayworth's office abruptly 6 months before the Crane murder. No public explanation, just a quiet resignation and a vanishing act. She ran, Lakin murmured. She knew something. With Martin's approval, they tracked Letty down to a rundown motel in rural Nebraska, where she worked at the front desk under a different last name. When Cavery and Lakin arrived, Letty nearly slammed the door in their faces. "I have nothing to say," she hissed, eyes full of panic. "You don't have to say it," Cavery told her gently. "Just listen." It took an hour, but eventually Letty cracked. She invited them in, trembling, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. Her story spilled out in whispers. I found things, she said. Receipts. Transfers. Bribes. Crane confronted Eldrick in private, told him he was going to report everything. 2 days later, Crane was dead. Then the knife shows up, and suddenly Judson Wesley, who had no connection to the money, is the one on trial. Did you know about the camera shutdown? Lakin asked. Letty nodded slowly. I heard Eldrick on the phone. I didn't know who he was talking to, but he said, I want it dark between 9 and 10. Clean. No footage. No noise. That's when I quit. Cavery looked her in the eyes. Will you testify? Letty hesitated. Then nodded. I'll tell them everything. It was the final piece. A living witness. Not just evidence, but a voice. One who had been inside the lion's den. When they returned to St. Louis, Martin's team updated the court immediately with Letty's sworn statement and contact information. The Supreme Court issued a notice within 24 hours, an emergency evidentiary hearing had been granted. But time was suffocating. Judson's execution date was now just 9 days away. The hearing would take place in front of a panel of 3 judges, one of whom, Judge Tremaine Holt, had been a known ally of Hayworth during his early career. It made Cavery nervous. Political favors ran deep, and corruption didn't vanish overnight. The night before the hearing, Cavery visited her father again. This time, she didn't cry. Judson looked worn, thinner than ever, his knuckles bruised from gripping the edge of the steel bed frame every night in silence. But when he saw her, something shifted. You found something, he said. She nodded. I found everything. He reached his hand to the glass, and she pressed hers against it. I'm proud of you, he whispered. You'll be home soon, she promised. He looked away, swallowing hard. I don't know if I believe that. You don't have to, she said. Just believe in me. They sat in silence for a few minutes, palms pressed, separated by the thick pain that had come to define their entire reality. And then Cavery stood up, her voice steady as she looked into his eyes. I'm going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow, and I'm going to burn his lies down to the ground. Judson said nothing. But he smiled. And for the first time in a long time, hope didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like fire. The courtroom was different this time. No longer a place where Cavery sat helplessly, watching her father be condemned. This time, she walked in with her head high and purpose in her stride. Beside her, Martin Ames looked calm but focused, his notes tucked neatly into a worn leather folder. Lakin followed with a laptop bag, already scanning the room for familiar faces and potential threats. The benches were full, some with media, others with citizens of Elm Ridge who had returned to see the girl they'd once pitied now march into court with fire in her eyes. And in the front row sat the man who started it all, Eldrick Hayworth. His presence was unexpected but bold. He sat smugly with his chin slightly raised, wearing an immaculate navy blue suit and a half-smile that made Cavery's stomach twist. He was confident. Too confident. The 3-judge panel took their seats, including Judge Tremaine Holt, who had a long-standing reputation for favoring powerful figures in the justice system. Cavery didn't trust him. But the facts were no longer whispers in the dark. Now, they would be spoken aloud, in the light. Martin began with quiet gravity. Your Honors, we stand here not only to defend an innocent man, but to confront the collapse of a system designed to protect him. Judson Wesley is not just a victim of circumstance, he is a casualty of deliberate deception. And we are prepared to prove it. He called their first witness, Tobin Hartwell. The technician stepped forward nervously, but his voice held. He testified under oath about disabling the surveillance system the night of Milton Crane's murder. He admitted he was paid in cash, given a burner phone and a note with specific times. And when asked who had hired him, I recognized the voice and the face a few days later. It was Eldrick Hayworth. Gasps rippled through the room. Cavery watched Hayworth's smile twitch, just for a second. Next, Lakin presented the recovered footage. The moment it played on the overhead screen, grainy, time-stamped, irrefutable, showing a tall man exiting Crane's home at 9:53 p.m., the room fell into a tense silence. The silver watch glinting under the man's sleeve was impossible to ignore. Martin followed with the digital file from Crane's laptop, the ethics complaint, the money trail, the connections to shell companies tied to Hayworth's name. Finally, he played the voice memo. If this reaches the wrong hands, I may not make it to the hearing. But I won't be silent. The judges took notes furiously. Even Judge Holt seemed to lean in, brows drawn tight. Then came the final witness, Letty Van Rose. She looked small on the stand, but her voice was steady as she spoke about her time working under Hayworth, the day she found financial records pointing to embezzlement, the threats she overheard, and the moment she realized Crane was in danger. Hayworth told someone to make it dark that night, she said. No footage. No noise. When Crane turned against him, he made sure someone else took the fall. Martin let the silence hang. Finally, he looked toward the panel. If this courtroom has any claim to justice, then it must recognize that the case against Judson Wesley was poisoned from the start. The evidence was false. The witnesses were manipulated. And the prosecutor, your prosecutor, used the law to hide his crime. The judges retired for deliberation. It felt like forever. Cavery sat motionless. Her heart pounded in her ears. Her fingers clenched together so tightly her knuckles went white. She didn't look at Hayworth. She didn't need to. After nearly an hour, the judges returned. Judge Holt stood and delivered the verdict. His voice was level, even cold, but the words hit like thunder. This court finds sufficient grounds for wrongful conviction and prosecutorial misconduct. We hereby overturn the conviction of Judson Wesley and order his immediate release from custody pending full reinvestigation. Cavery couldn't breathe. Martin closed his eyes with relief. Lakin grabbed her hand. But the courtroom erupted, not in applause, but in stunned murmurs and disbelief. Hayworth stood slowly, still trying to maintain composure, but security guards were already moving in. A state investigator approached him, badge out, and murmured something none of them could hear. Hayworth paled. The color drained from his face. He didn't speak as they led him out. Cavery sat still for a long time, her hands shaking in her lap. Her father wasn't free yet, but he was no longer condemned. It wasn't justice, not yet. But it was a beginning. The prison gates opened at 7:12 a.m. on a quiet Friday morning. There was no crowd, no press, no grand announcement. Just a soft breeze, the distant chirping of birds, and the slow, echoing footsteps of a man who had spent the last 4 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Judson Wesley stepped into the morning light wearing the same clothes he'd been arrested in, now loose on his thinner frame. His beard was grayer, his eyes lined with age and exhaustion, but he stood tall. The moment the sun hit his face, he paused, closed his eyes, and breathed in like it was the first real breath he'd taken in years. And then he saw her. Cavery stood just a few feet away, holding a bouquet of white tulips, his wife's favorite. Her face was trembling with emotion, a soft smile on her lips and tears already running down her cheeks. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. They didn't need to. Judson stepped forward, and she dropped the flowers just in time to throw her arms around him. He held her like a lifeline, like the world could fall away and he'd still be standing because she was in his arms. You did it, he whispered, voice cracking. You really did it. Cavery shook her head against his shoulder. We did it. Later that afternoon, they returned to their old house, the one that had sat quiet and empty for years. Dust covered the furniture. The fridge was empty. The wallpaper had faded in places from sunlight and time. But it was still home. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as father and daughter entered together. No one came to greet them. No one offered apologies. But neither of them cared. They had already survived the worst the world could throw at them. Over the following weeks, things slowly began to shift. Judson's exoneration made local and eventually national news. The Innocence Alliance filed for official compensation from the state. The Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into Eldrick Hayworth and his past convictions. Other cases began unraveling. More victims came forward. Hayworth, once seen as untouchable, now faced multiple charges: tampering with evidence, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and potentially even second-degree murder. His reputation crumbled. His power evaporated. But for Judson and Cavery, justice was never about revenge. It was about healing. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the sycamore trees, Judson sat on the porch while Cavery brought out 2 mugs of tea. They sipped in silence for a moment before he spoke. "You know, I used to think the world was fair. That if you told the truth and worked hard, things would go right in the end." Cavery looked over at him. "You still believe that?" "I believe in you," he said. "And I think that might be better." She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. They didn't talk about prison that night. Or Hayworth. Or the 4 years they lost. They talked about planting a garden in the backyard. About fixing up the old shed. About maybe getting a dog. Simple things. Soft things. Things that tasted like peace. In the end, it wasn't the courts or the state or the law that saved Judson Wesley. It was his daughter. A girl who refused to be silent. A girl who stared into the face of a broken system and did the unthinkable. She beat it. And now, with the truth laid bare and the future open wide, the Wesleys finally began to live again. Not as victims. Not as headlines. But as survivors. As a family. An innocent father is days away from execution, until his teenage daughter uncovers a buried secret that turns the entire justice system upside down. What she does next will leave you speechless.